Aaisha. So, Aaisha, I will. It's very good to meet you. Aaisha is a global diversity professional with over 7 years of diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI). So let's make sure that we've got the right acronym. She's been doing that as a program manager and experiences some of the largest and most financially successful legal and financial services firms in the nation, in academic institutions and on community boards. She currently serves as the Assistant Vice President and DE&I Manager at Alliant Insurance, which is a top 10 national brokerage firm, where she will help to lead the company's diversity strategy and initiatives. Her former role as Global DEI Plan Project Manager, Diversity and Inclusion Senior Coordinator, has allowed her to be part of a function that executes diversity efforts across 55 offices in the Americas, in Europe, in Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific. So she's the author of 2 grant-funded books and has traveled locally, nationally, and internationally to speak about a wide range of DE&I related topics. Aaisha, very welcome. It's a subject that I feel quite passionately about. I know that one of the things you're going to be talking about is that lots of organizations just like to tick the box, but actually you've got to do it properly. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say today. Welcome to the summit, and hand over to you.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. Good morning from the East Coast. I know we have different time zones here, so just thank you for being here to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, you know, maybe at some point, Tony, we should mention what the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion are, because sometimes they're used interchangeably in the industry. But let me share my screen and we can get started. Can everyone see my screen? Maybe a thumbs up or something. Okay, yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, so today we're talking a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion innovation. But before we go into the innovation piece, I think it's important to talk a little bit about what the traditional pieces of diversity, equity, and inclusion are. And even before we go into that, why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important, specifically in the insurance industry? And I think that the top answer for that is because the insurance industry is one of the most homogenous industries across the board. And if we're looking at just the data, you know, close to 70 to 90% of people in most insurance agencies tend to be white. And across the board, about 12.4% are Black, 6.2% are Asian. And even though 51% tend to be women, so there's gender diversity, when we actually look at the data more extensively, we notice that that is closer to the bottom. And as you go to the top, that percentage decreases significantly to 20 to 10 to 7% when you're going into senior executive positions. So we clearly have an issue, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. But where do traditional approaches come from? And it's particularly, we're talking today about unconscious bias trainings. So believe it or not, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a pretty new field. I mean, compared to science, math, it's only been around since the early 1900s. And unconscious bias trainings haven't been, even though they've been used for a while, they aren't known to everyone. And, you know, it's important to acknowledge where it's suddenly become this huge buzz phrase. And that was about a year ago, when George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, that tragedy that happened, it really caused people to pause and to question and to think about the ways that their organizations are structured, how they're being run, how they're being treated. And suddenly, you're seeing unconscious bias everywhere. A lot of organizations, it was their go-to solution when people were upset. That was what they did to try and create a difference. You know, overall, it's an $8 billion industry. We've spent $8 billion a year on unconscious bias trainings, but is it effective, right? How are we using it and why are we using it? There have been hundreds of studies done on unconscious bias trainings. And just to clarify for those of you who may have heard implicit bias trainings, it's the same thing. It's internal. So that's why you may be seeing me even use it interchangeably as well. But to go back to what I was saying, there's hundreds of studies that have been done on this. And they suggest that anti-bias trainings, they don't reduce bias, they don't alter behavior, and they don't change the workplace. And the way that these studies are done is that people complete the Harvard's implicit association test. And then after that, they're given an unconscious bias training, and then they take it again, that test. And what we're seeing is over 70% of people, their score doesn't change. There's no alteration in that. And yet we're spending this amount of money, and it makes us wonder why. Well, for one thing, it's a baseline understanding, right? It's bringing about awareness. And that's really in line with some of our other traditional efforts. There's trainings, that's you know, racial bias trainings, unconscious bias. All of these trainings are one of the most common ways that we tackle, you know, these efforts. Cultural events, Pride, Hispanic Heritage Month, which we're in right now, those kinds of programming, that's another traditional approach that we do. Statements. So these things, there's nothing wrong with them. And in fact, I encourage them as a baseline thing, right? It's important to have this to draw that awareness, to bring education about these different things, about these different cultures, about what unconscious bias is. But by itself, it's ineffective. So really the question is, you know, what do we do in addition to that? How do we attach accountability mechanics? How do we attach some kind of action component to this? Because by itself, it's not going to create change, even if it brings awareness. Because what is awareness going to do if we don't know how to change the systems and processes that are being impacted? And some of the other traditional approaches that I've listed here, and I'm sure many organizations are using these as well, including ours, peer mentoring and ERGs. Both of these are great. They're both vital to an organization's culture. But some of the problems with some of the traditional ways that they've been used, peer mentoring, just the name itself, peer mentoring. If you have your peers mentoring you and they're at the same level as you, how is that going to help you get to that next level, right? So mentorship programs, traditionally, having them structured that way, it puts the burden on employees to train each other. And it also, you know, creates that problem because if you're at the same level, how do you get to that next level? So that's obviously not working, and we have to relook at how we're structuring those programs. And ERGs, they're also really wonderful. Some of the traditional ways that they've been doing it is that they're not funded sometimes. And so if you're not funding your ERGs, how effective can they really be? And when companies put the entire burden on individuals to lead those efforts, well, diverse people are already at a disadvantage, and then you're telling them to head these organizations with their identity groups and to provide all the support. So ERGs can be effective if you structure them and standardize them and provide resources. And so that's what I want to make clear is like traditional approaches, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're very minimal in what they can do. And if we're noticing that they're not creating change, then we have to figure out a different way to do it. We don't want to reinvent the wheel completely, but we want to do enough so that there is change. And some of the questions that I like to think about is how do we go from a moment to a movement, right? Anytime there's a crisis and we do all these DE&I initiatives, that's great. But how are we going to make sure that we continue to do them? How do we sustain that? And that's something to think about. How do we leverage momentum to create meaningful change? Meaningful change means it's data-driven, that there is clear evidence of that, of the numbers changing, of people, qualitative data, of people actually saying that they feel supported, that you're seeing them advance. And how do we go from different results using the same methods? That's something that I've been saying, right? Like if we're continuing to do these traditional efforts, we're not going to see that change. And that's going to leave us exactly where we're at. So what we don't want to do, right, if things aren't working, and where we do these unconscious bias trainings and we realize, it's not very effective, the worst case scenario is not doing anything. Because when you leave unconscious bias in the workplace to fester, there's a lot of ramifications. And for the sake of time, I'm only bringing up one example. The insurance industry is quite new to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. In fact, there's no large books on this right now. So what I did is I brought a very well-known example from the legal industry that really demonstrates some of the ramifications of unconscious bias. Because one of the biggest misconceptions about unconscious bias is that it's personal, right? It's your feelings. So as long as you are, you're not thinking about the individual, it's not a problem. It's like politics. It's like religion. It's your personal kind of mentality. But no, unconscious bias, it gets put into systems and processes. And so this example, it was an experiment, and it was done by a leadership consulting firm known as Nextion. And essentially what they did is they worked with law firm partners, 60 partners across 22 different law firms. And they created a legal memo. The partners created a legal memo. And what Nextion did is created intentionally 22 errors in that legal memo. And then they had participants, they had partners from different law firms, and they asked them to be a part of a written analysis study. And they told half of the partners who were reviewing this memo written by other partners that it was written by a Black man. And the other half, they told them that it was written by a white man. And when the partners reviewed the memo, they gave a 4.1 out of 5 to the participant when they thought it was written by a white man. The wording that was used was that they have a lot of potential, they have good analytical skills. And that same memo, when they thought it was written by a Black man, they said it was average at best. They gave it a score of 3.2 out of 5, and they said it needed a lot of work. The other thing we noticed is that they were more critical when they thought it was written by a Black man. They looked at the errors and they found, and that's written the wrong way, they found 5.8 out of the 7 errors when it was written by a Black man, and when it was written by a white man, they only found 2.9 out of the 7 errors. So that is just one small example when we're only looking at, feedback. This can impact hiring. It impacts, when we're thinking about succession planning, when we're thinking about who do we advance, who gets promotions. All of these processes are impacted by unconscious bias, and that's why we can't let it fester. So what do we do next, right? Unconscious bias trainings, by themselves, we know they're not effective. It's still a great baseline, understanding, so it's still good to do it. But how do we, change that to add some mechanisms to it? And I want to talk a little bit about at the individual level and how we can institutionalize it, right? So at the individual level, there's 3 different things that we can do. One, we want people to, do the education themselves. We want people to not consider this a organizational problem. Like the organization's going to fix it. There's no responsibility in us. There's actually some very easy things that we can do to continue the learning and to mitigate unconscious bias. And the first one is to have open and honest conversations with our colleagues, both informally, formally, about biases, personal experiences. What we find is that people in the workplace are scared to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. They see it as something taboo. They're worried about saying the wrong thing. But if you're having these candid conversations and you're just learning, it makes it easier to approach that topic continuously and to bring it up in other areas as well. And the other thing is to own your learning. You know, ignorance is not an excuse. And it also scares people, but if we're learning, if we're talking to people, if we own our mistakes, because owning your learning means you're also owning your mistakes, it makes it easier to do all of those things. The other level, once you get past that first level, is to really start, you know, questioning. So you're going to play detective. You're looking at work opportunities. If you're a supervisor or your manager, think about where those meaningful work opportunities are going. Where's that developmental feedback, mentorship, sponsorship? Who are you providing it to? There's a really great, you know, thought leader in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space. His name is Jerry Kang. And something interesting, and it's been with me in these last few years, is something he said is, bees, right? Queen bees and worker bees. People assume that they're born that way, but in reality, queen bees are not born queen bees. They're created because of what they're fed, the royal jelly. So depending on how much royal jelly you're allocating to them, that's how they become the queen bee if they have more of it. And so it's the same with meaningful work opportunities and developmental feedback. We have this argument about meritocracy in the insurance industry, and to be fair, in other industries as well. But we have this argument about how some people are just better at doing this job than others, that they are the ones that they have potential, we need to do that. But really, we're giving them, we connect with them, we give them those opportunities, and we're developing them. They didn't just become better, we gave them those opportunities. So think about equity, which is resource allocation. How are you allocating those different opportunities? And then second, and this is easy, notice who is part of the team and who isn't. Look at the demographic composition. How diverse is your team? You know, how can you make it more diverse and more inclusive? And then lastly, you know, speaking up, standardizing processes when you can, and reviewing them, you know, and reviewing the practices, the policies, the procedures, programs that you personally have a responsibility or influence over. So that comes back to you. And then advocating for issues, acknowledging when people bring up barriers that they have, and then, you know, speaking on their behalf. So those are individual level. And now how do we take those same things and we institutionalize them, right? So the first one, having open and honest conversations, work on your feedback process. Every organization has that. How can we make it so that these conversations are conducive and they're productive, and they're, you know, and both the person who's giving the feedback and the one that's receiving it, it's mutually beneficial for them, and that they feel like there's something that's coming from it. The second part, owning our learning. When we own our learning and we have these conversations, that's part of the cultural norms. So that's how you institutionalize it, is by having those conversations, by doing programming that does that, and it creates those cultural norms. The second piece of it, being thoughtful about work allocation, that could be leadership training. So train your supervisors, train your managing directors, so that they're more mindful and they understand what meaningful work opportunities is and how to allocate it and how to distribute them. And then in terms of, you know, your team, start tracking how diverse are different teams, and how do we make them more diverse. If you're tracking it, you know, anything that's tracked, I'm really a big proponent of data. Anything that's tracked, that's things that you can change because you have it there. Numbers speak for themselves. And then lastly, standardizing processes. That's all about reassessing and updating old practices and policies. I like to think of people as creatures of habits, because we are, but organizations are no different. So if you let an organization, the same policies are going to stay the same way over 10s, 20, like, you know, over decades. And so you want to continue to make sure that there's a mechanism that assesses them every year, whether that's a consultant, whether you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional within your organization, but you want to make sure that you're assessing and continuing to update those practices and policies. And in terms of advocating for issues, you want to make sure that you are looking at your leadership composition goals. because advocating for issues is great, but we want to make sure that we're also advancing and that we have leaders that are diverse as well. So keep track of your leadership composition goals over time. I think every quarter is really important. And I think that's all I had. These are just, since these PowerPoints are going to go to all attendees, I left these questions for you, for everyone that's attending, just to think about it. And so you can unpack some of the things that we talked about, and really, think about it, discuss it with each other, or individually reflect on it. And if there are, I want to make sure there's time for questions.
Thank you very much. That is really very, very interesting. A couple of things I picked up on there. Frankly, studies have repeatedly shown that the commercial value of strong DE&I efforts. And the numbers are all there. It's not up for dispute. I thought your NextGen case study was absolutely fascinating. Just proves the point with blind trials. And I think your queen bees are not born, they develop based on what they're fed. That sentence is going to last. I'm going to repeat that and steal that one and use that again, if you don't mind.
The royal jelly.
It's the royal jelly. But so a question, and this is one that I have I've struggled with in organizations that I've worked with, is that as you've identified, so many organizations just look at it and say, yeah, we've got a program, we've got somebody put control in control of that, and people have their right training courses, so everything's okay. Of course it's not. And it's all about, as I've just been talking to Aaisha about, changing the people and changing culture is the single most difficult thing that you can do within the business. At one end you've got the actively denying people who have to go along a journey which involves in recognizing, accepting, and engaging, and then moving through to the point where they're actively supporting and being allies, and changing their behaviors. That is not an easy thing to do. So you've got some good measures in the slides that you've been talking about, how you would do those kinds of things. But what do you think are the most important ways in which organizations can make this real, as opposed to just ticking the boxes? We've got the program, everything's all right, don't worry about it. How can they change people's behaviors? Right.
So accountability. That's one of the biggest things before we can change the culture. And change in any, and as I mentioned, people are creatures of habits, organizations are the same. People really don't like change. And so when you're introduced, and diversity, equity, inclusion, that's why I love my job. I mean, people are like, oh my God, this person, these people, this division, they're gonna try to change the way we've always done things. And so, initially people are not going to be very happy. They're going to be reticent to change. And so, you're going to have to expect that. Initially what you're going to want to do is to look at the data, to really analyze it and get substantive data so you can showcase, for people that are like, no, I mean, I don't see it. This bias doesn't exist in our organization. Well, here's the numbers. They're showing us that there is clearly a problem. But then second, you create those accountability measures and put them in place first. Maybe there's going to be some tokenism in the beginning, like we have to have a certain percentage here, certain percentage there. That's how it might feel. But once we set those accountability measures in place and we have those systems and processes, eventually the cultural norms and the cultural acceptance and the cultural change, that comes later. And that's one of the most challenging pieces about the work that we do in diversity, equity, inclusion, is that change is slow. But, there is a process, and and once you set those things in place, that all comes later.
Okay. So, I mean, I know from my consulting days that, you have an emotional journey of change, which is the initial euphoria and the excitement about it. And everybody goes, yeah, we're doing this in our organization, great. And then it sort of dips down to the, oh, does that mean that I've got to change?
They like the idea of it. They're like, okay, yes, people are not happy, so let's put this stuff in place. I mean, I love this diversity stuff, like let's do it. But then when it realizes the actual impact that it's going to have on each individual, then it's like, wait, why do we need to do this? Like, why is it important? So it's, you know, it really, the data is really important. And I think that that's one of the best places to start if you're earlier on your DE&I journey, like, is to really collect your data, to create metrics, and to create accountability measures. And from there, programming and all of that can come into play.
So presenting the data is one thing, but changing the behaviors based on that data is another. And in my experience, the you know, once they've gone through that peak and they've got down into the trough, the way that you make it then go back up again as you're going through time, is to make it in people's interests to change, make them want
business
to.
Case. That's why.
How do you take that data? How do you take the data that you collected and those and that clear need for making that change into something that people say, actually, I want to do this. It's in my interest, and I'll get advantage out of it.
Yeah, great question. You know, it really starts from leadership. So if you have leadership buy-in, then it's going to trickle down, and it's going to be going to the managing directors. And, you know, you have to make that business case to leadership first. And the way that you do that is you look at the market research. So how are our peers doing, right? Because we're competing for the same clients, and if our peers are doing well, and then the second part is to look at what our clients are requesting, right? And we're seeing an uptick in the insurance industry. We're seeing an uptick in the amount of clients that are asking for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and we're losing business. You know, some insurance agencies were losing millions of dollars, sometimes billions, based on not having enough diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, efforts and change within the organization. So you start with looking at the market research, and you start by looking at what clients are requesting and the amount of revenue you're losing. And then you look at the numbers, and then you can make a case for goals. And once you've set goals, then you go to the managing directors, you go to the leadership right under it, and you tell them, like, here's what we need you to do. Here's what your department looks like. And here's the goals that are realistic. You know, you work with them to set realistic goals, and then they're going to, like, you know, pass the urgency down. So it goes from the top. It's not possible. And sometimes what we do traditionally is go from the bottom to the top, but it has to be both ways.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. That's the only way to change cultures as well as changing individual behaviours. I mean, it does occur to me that as an industry, insurance has always suffered from the, oh God, I don't want to work in insurance, it's so boring. And the fight for talent, good quality talent, is one that the industry potentially is going to lose if we don't change the attractiveness for new generations to come into this industry. I mean, I personally know that my son is an underwriter. I suggested to him that he should go into insurance when he left university, and he came out with the immortal phrase, "I would rather stick needles in my eyes than work in something as boring as insurance." Long story short, he ended up being an underwriter, and he loves his job, absolutely loves his job, but it had to be opened up to him. So being able to demonstrate to the younger generation that actually insurance is a great place to work, where you have that opportunity, irrespective of who you are and your personal circumstances before you join the organization.
And share that opportunity. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because people always say, like, you know, with insurance, like, it's different than other industries. We can't find that talent. There is none there. Well, actually, where are you looking, right? So what about all these agencies, this Latin American insurance agency, these National Association of African American Insurance Agents? I mean, there are agencies, there are professional organizations with insurance professionals of different races, of gender, and then you go to them and you tell them, you know, like, you support them, or you sponsor that organization, and that, you know, cause or do career fairs there. And so then you're bringing in talent that way, but you're also sponsoring them. And so they're talking to younger people, like you talk to your son. And so you're bringing in people that way, because people tend to listen more to people that they know or that they identify with. I mean, that's just fact. So there is ways to do it. I think we just haven't been doing them.
So that's going to be my question. Do you think we're doing it?
No,
we need to change that. We need to change that.
Yeah, I think that we're using the same methods of hiring, We're using LinkedIn, we're using all the traditional methods, which is great, but insurance industry is a little bit different in that what you just mentioned right now, there's not a lot of people that find it attractive. There's not a lot of people that are qualified. And so you have to go even further and do pipeline development. And to do pipeline development, you want to go to those different organizations. You can't just go to the same place and do career fairs like at colleges and just expect that to bring results. You have to now look at identity groups, and you have to be more intentional about where you're going for those efforts.
So as well as having programs for the existing organization, you've got to think about your hiring strategy and how you're making that much more diverse. I mean, I threw that open to an organization that I was working for previously and said, you know, all of our IT sales guys are middle-aged white guys, mainly because we have recruited from our competitors who also have a sales force which are very much like that. What we should be thinking about is recruiting smart young people who are maybe not in that mold and being the organization that trains them to be really good at what they do. And it was like, oh, that sounds like a really good idea. I thought, well, that's pretty obvious.
It's obvious, but you know, people, you're going with, you know, you have to look at the hiring practice to see how standardized they are, because if we don't have a rubric, we're going to go off of our own biases. We're going to connect better with people like us. And so if you have a certain group in that leadership, then you're going to see across the board the same demographic, the same, you know, all of that. And so no, that's definitely very true in that case.
Yeah. Look, are there any other questions you have from our audience at the moment?
No, there aren't any questions. I personally have a question to Aaisha. Like, I found the presentation quite revolutionary, if I term. So Aaisha, if you could just tell me, how do the LGBTQ employees drive the inclusive culture?
Yeah, and that's a great question, particularly within insurance. You know, I've noticed just doing market research that not a lot of insurance organizations, some of them don't even collect LGBTQ data, and that's really important. So I think that one, you know, making sure that you're collecting that data, because allowing people to self-identify as LGBTQ can be really important in helping us understand the culture and how inclusive it is to LGBTQ people, regardless if they decide to, you know, self-identify or not. You can look at the percentage of people that elect not to self-identify as a lever and as an indicator of how comfortable they are with doing that. So that's one indicator. But the other is to make sure that you have an ERG, an employee resource group, for them, and that you're dedicating resources to them, and that you're, you know, you're listening to what their needs are, and that's how they can motivate. That's how they can change it. And the other thing that it will do is, if you're looking at diversity, diverse is any group that's underrepresented. So that can be race, gender, LGBTQ. And so in the insurance industry, we look at gender and race a lot. But there could be a lot of, you know, non-diverse men that are LGBTQ. And so that could be skewing your data as well, because they're also diverse. So that's one motivator for people to actually look at it if we're looking at the business case. But otherwise, you know, it's just important to make sure that we're self-identifying and that we're creating a space for LGBTQ employees as well. And that's how you're going to build a more inclusive culture.
Thanks, Aaisha. I could not type the question because probably I'm the host, so I could not type the question. I had to ask. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your question.
Well, Aaisha, I think we could go on all day talking about the subject, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Absolutely fascinating. I think it's something that the insurance industry desperately needs to address. It's steeped in conservatism as an industry. But actually, it's a nice industry to work in, and people are ultimately responsive to these kinds of initiatives. And I think it's great that you're leading the thought in these areas. It's been a fascinating presentation, and I'm sure stimulated some thought amongst our audience. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Look forward to hearing what else happens as you carry on your quest.
Appreciate it. Pleasure to be here, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. And the other presentations, I hope they go well.